Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with the 7 ontological arguments for the existence of God. This is going to be objections to the Mereological Ontological Argument for the existence of God. As I offered it, the Mereological Ontological Argument goes as follows. I exist, therefore something exists. Wherever something exists, the Mereological sum of all things exists. Therefore, God, the sum of all things, exists. I'm going to take a look at each of these premises and see if there's spots where we can object to any of them, and then take a look at ways we can object to conclusions drawn by the argument. So, premise 1, I exist. While most people are going to hold this, the true skeptic still doesn't even believe this. If you're curious how you can doubt Descartes' cogito or doubt existing yourself, check out my videos on doubting the cogito. And it also seems to make this argument not really ontological in the sense we explained it in the first video in this series, because it now has to do with the world. It's not something to really derive from pure reason alone. It's derived by some existence, some thing in the world, some metaphysical fact of the world, as opposed to some sense of reason, because it doesn't seem to be an analytical truth that you exist. Someone might disagree, though. Premise 2, something exists. Once again, that's just existential generalization. You can, as I have done, doubt logic and be skeptical of this, but otherwise, you're probably going to think that premise 2 does follow from premise 1. Premise 3, wherever something exists, the Mereological sum of all things exists. I said this was something of the composition principle in Mereology. There's always a Mereological sum of any two or more parts. This principle is, however, controversial. Anyone whose Mereology doesn't include a claim like this is not going to be convinced by this premise. There are many Mereologies that do include principles that look like this or this principle itself. However, if your Mereology doesn't include such a principle, you're going to be completely unconvinced by this argument. Such as if you were an atomist, you would have absolutely no reason to believe this principle, believe this premise, or conclude the conclusion of this argument. And finally, therefore God, the sum of all things, exists. This is saying God is simply another word for the sum of all things, but I'm a little worried about this. If you define God as simply all things, then what's the important difference between God and the universe? If there's more evil in the world or in the universe than there is good, then is God more evil than he is good? How can he be all good if he is all things and some things are evil? If most things are hydrogen atoms, does that mean that God is mostly hydrogen? And if God is all things in the universe, isn't he contingent himself? Which seems to be a bit of a problem for a lot of other arguments for the existence of God. Just some thoughts. It really doesn't seem to me that we can conclude God as in an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, all good. God exists from the sum of all things, or some object that is all things, or has all things as its parts existing. That was objections to the Mereological Ontological Argument for the existence of God. Next up, we're going to be looking at the religious experience argument for the existence of God and the higher order ontological argument for the existence of God. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.